Hi and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman and today I'm going to be sharing with you how to make the last 3 blocks that are required for this quilt behind me. This is the Ducks in My Pond quilt. Last week I shared with you how to make the Handy Andy block, the Scrappy Handy Andy block. This week I'm going to share with you how to do the Ducks and Ducklings, the Sister's Choice, and Grandma's Favorite blocks. So I've got all of my scraps ready to go here and I'm going to show you on the tabletop how to put these together. On my tabletop here you'll see I've got the sheet which will show the requirements of what squares we need for each of these blocks cut from our scraps or yardage for any of the patterns that I offer, whether they're in this book or any of the single patterns that are on my website. You can simply use yardage if you don't have a scrap stash, and then just take the yardage and cut out the squares according to the lights, mediums, and darks that are indicated in all of the patterns. And I have actually used my Speedy Solutions scrap stash. So for these 3 blocks, I have gone to my Speedy Solutions stash and I have pulled my 2.5-inch bin, my 3-inch bin. This is for the half square triangles, which will trim down to be 2.5 inches. And I've also grabbed my 5-inch bin. That's what I'm needing for these 3 blocks. Let me move this out of the way here. All right, so all of these patterns that I'm sharing with you, it's in my Speedy Solutions patterns book, and this corresponds to my techniques book. I'll have a link below. If you have not already seen the video that teaches you how to cut, sort, organize, store, and then use your scrap stash, I'll have that video tutorial linked below so you can watch that. And then the techniques book, my Speedy Solutions techniques book, corresponds to that video. I do have a book set. I'll link that out to my website if you wanted to take a peek at that. But let's get started here in identifying what we need for the Grandma's Favorite block. I'm going to move that out of the way here. And here is the Grandma's Favorite block. This is what it looks like. Every block that you make, you can dissect it into parts and pieces or units. In this block, we do have 4 pinwheels that we're creating. Let me bring that closer to you. So there are the 4 pinwheels, and those are going to be in the corners. And then we have these 2 patch units and then the center square. All of these squares in here are 2.5-inch squares that I have pulled. And these half square triangles are made using 3-inch squares, which we will simply pair up. So I have 8 darks, 8 lights. I will simply pair them up right sides together, and I've taught this many times in my tutorials. But you'll draw a line down the center. You will stitch 1/4 inch on both sides of that line. Then you'll cut on the drawn line, and then you'll square up each half square triangle unit to 2.5 inches. I'm trying to open it here, so let's pretend that I've already done that. That would be 1 unit, and the opposite side would be the other unit. So for every pair, you're getting 2 half square triangles. And then, of course, each pair has to be squared up to 2.5 inches, so they match these squares here. So I have 8 dark 3-inch squares, 8 light 3-inch squares. Once they are paired together and I create the half square triangles, I'm going to have a total of 16 half square triangles, which is exactly what I need. I need 4 half square triangles in each corner. So there's my 16 half square triangles. So what I like to do for every block, I typically like to go ahead and create all the half square triangles that I need. Now what I'm doing for this class here is just showing you how to make each of these blocks. So I'm only pulling scraps for 1 block. Depending on how many of the Grandma's blocks or Grandma's Favorite block you need, you're going to pull the amount of squares based on a number of blocks you need. So if you're making the wall quilt, you'll need 8 of these blocks. So therefore you need to times or multiply all of that by 8. If you're making the queen quilt, you need 18 of these blocks. Therefore you need to multiply all of that by 18. And if you're just making a completely different quilt but you're using this block pattern, then just identify how many blocks you need and then multiply this by the number of blocks that you plan to make. So I've gone ahead and I've drawn the line, the diagonal line on each of the pairs. So I've got a dark pair with a light pair. I've got them all ready to go. I've drawn a diagonal line, and I'm simply going to take these 8 pairs to my sewing machine. I'm going to do this in a chain stitching fashion, or assembly line if you will, where I'm going to start sewing a scant 1/4 of an inch on this side of that drawn line, and just continue on down and do all 8 of them. Then I'm going to flip around and come back and sew a scant 1/4 of an inch on the opposite side. Then I'm going to cut on the drawn line. I'm going to press them open and square them up to 2.5 inches. So that's how I'm going to accomplish that. Then I can come back and put together what I need for the rest of the block. I have pulled 2.5 inch medium squares here. These represent the peach in this block. I've pulled 2.5 inch squares here. There's 4 of each of these. These represent the burgundy in the block. And this one, it's one of the 2.5 inch squares. It's a dark one, and it's going to be for the center. So once I've finished my half square triangles, got them cut, pressed, squared up, then I can bring it back here and show you how I'm going to lay out the square. I have sewn mine in assembly line fashion. When I cut mine apart, I do like to cut off from stitching line to stitching line here, which gets rid of that dog ear. So that's what I like to do as I'm cutting them. I simply cut from stitching line to stitching line. And let me show that to you here, give you a close-up. Stitching line to stitching line. So I'm going to do all of that, then I'm going to cut on the diagonal line and open and press them, and then I'm going to square them up to 2.5 inches. I am using my Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer. I'm using the trimmer A. I'm using the 2.5 inch line here, that stitching line. I am simply lining it up on the stitching line of my half square triangle unit, getting rid of the excess, and there I have a 2.5 inch half square triangle. So I've just finished cutting all of these on the side here, and it's important that each and every half square triangle gets trimmed down to exactly 2.5 inches so the entire block goes together perfectly. Now let's start laying out this block. Maybe it's easiest for you if you start in the center, and this is going to be my center. I'm using these medium, and they're mostly greens, and I'm going to put those right next to that center. They're what I'm using for this peach. And for these burgundies here, I'm using these darks. These are all 2.5 inch squares. All right, so that takes care of the center of it. Now I have to make the pinwheels in each of these corners. So let's take a look at how we can do this. And I'm trying to grab different pinwheels so I have a different look to each. There, I think, whoops, nope, I don't have this correct. There we go. That's a pinwheel, there we go. Okay, let's go over here. Take a look at this. I'm watching the picture and trying to make sure that I am placing this in here correctly. I believe I did that one all right. Okay, let's go over here. And this one here. And then we'll have this one, this one. All right, do I have pinwheels? I believe I do. So then you can simply web this together. And what I like to do is start with the second row and flip it onto the front, and then continue on row by row until the whole block is put together. If you prefer to put your pinwheels together first, that's fine. Then you can put these 2 patches together and put this row together, and that row together. Whatever works best for you. This is the Grandma's Favorite block. I did have a mystery quilt pattern that used this block. It's a really fun one to put together. So now let's go on to our next one, which is Sister's Choice, and let's see how that's put together. So again, for each of these blocks that I'm creating for you today, I'm using my scraps. They're very, very scrappy. I'm using values here, lights, mediums, and darks. You can change the values of any of this in the block. You do not have to follow the value sequence that I am using. By changing the value, you actually create a different looking block, which is really kind of fun, so you might want to try that. So this one is Sister's Choice, and again, I like to break down the block. This is really similar to Grandma's Favorite. We've got 4 corner units here. They're not actually pinwheels. We're using 2 squares with a couple of half square triangles. Kind of looks like a rosebud, if you will. And then we're simply using the 2.5-inch squares again in the center of that block. Very simple to do. So I always like to start with my half square triangles and get those finished. For this block, we're pulling 3-inch squares for the half square triangles. So I have 4 of the lights and 4 of the darks, or mediums, whatever you choose to use. They will get paired up. We'll create half square triangles just like I did with the other block, and then we'll square them all up to 2.5 inches. Now we also need 2.5-inch squares for the rest of the block. This dark 2.5-inch square I'm going to use in the center. I'm going to use these 4 gray 2.5-inch squares for the light blue here. I'm going to use these 4 printed salmon-y colored 2.5-inch squares for these salmon squares. And then for these dark ones out here, I will use the dark 2.5-inch squares. I just noticed as I was demonstrating these that I have forgotten to pull the squares for these outer 4 corners. So I've grabbed from my 2.5-inch bin some of these 4 of these gold 2.5-inch squares. And so I had to add that down here because we definitely need those as well. So the first thing we're going to do is put together our half square triangles. Once those are done and squared up to 2.5 inches, then we're going to lay out the entire block based upon the diagram here. Now let's take these squares and the half square triangles that I've finished and squared down to 2.5 inches, and let's create our block. This is the Sister's Choice block. Again, I'll start in the center with the dark 2.5-inch square, which is in the center here. I am going to place what would be the light blue in the photo, but I'm using these grays that were in my scrap stash. Then I'm going to place these salmon, and these are all 2.5-inch squares. So I have those laid out there. I can also put my dark, where the dark green is, I can put these out here. Now let's work on our rosebud corners, if you will. So let's take 2 of these, and it looks like what we're going to do is make the darker points kiss in the center, and then we'll put a medium, and I'm going to use gold right out there. So there's my rosebud. Let's do one over here. I'm putting it together so that the darks kiss in the center, and there's the gold. And we'll do the same for these down here. And there is my Scrappy Sister's Choice. How fun is that? Again, make as many blocks as you need to of the Sister's Choice and of the Handy Andy and the Grandma's Favorite for whatever size quilt you happen to be making. And you'll put them together. You can do it the way I like to do it, which is webbing the block together, and I'll link a video for how to web a block in the description box below. Or if you want to create your units, you can certainly do that as well. Sew the units together and then sew it all together in 3 rows. Let's see now what we need to pull for the duck and ducklings block, which is another fast and fun one. So I have 2 pairs of a light and a medium 3-inch squares from which I'm going to make half square triangles, because we need a total of 4 half square triangles. So I'm going to use those to make these outer half square triangles. I have 4 3-inch squares that I'm simply going to cut on the diagonal to create a total of 8 triangles, and you'll see that here in just a minute. I have 2 5-inch dark squares from which I'm going to cut on the diagonal, so I have a total of 4 dark triangles, and that's what I'm going to be using to create these here. I do have 1 dark, this is going to be my burgundy for in the center. These 4 lights here I'm going to put where the blues are, and these medium greens I'm going to put where this salmon is. So these are all 2.5 inches, these are 3 inches, these are 5 inches. I've finished my half square triangles. I have them squared up to 2.5 inches. Now I'm going to cut these squares on the diagonal. There are 4 lights here. They are 3 inches, or 3-inch squares. I'm going to cut those on the diagonal. I have 8 triangles. I have 2 5-inch squares that I am going to cut on the diagonal. I might need a longer ruler here to do this. There we go. And I'm going to cut it once on the diagonal. So now I have a total of 4 of these larger dark triangles. Now let's lay the block out. And again, just follow the diagram, and I'm going to start in the center with this burgundy square. I'm using these for my light blue squares shown in the diagram. I am using here we go. We need these dark ones now. Let's go ahead and put these right out there like that. If you're cutting out the 5-inch squares for your whole quilt, you can make this much scrappier. Right now I just have these 2 colors, and I think it'd be nicer if it was all completely scrappy, but you're just going to have to pretend that it's nice and scrappy, because right now I just have those 2 cut. All right, then let's go ahead and put these are the salmons. I'm using these as opposed to the salmon, so now we have those. Now we have everything except this outside unit. So let's get the half square triangle, and then we have all of these that we are going to be sewing in there. And I'll show you, I'll demonstrate how that will be sewn here in just a minute. And of course, once you get all your seam allowances in here, all of this is going to match up nicely. All right, that has a crease in it. I didn't get that one pressed yet. All right, so these are the outer units, and they're going to match up with these dark triangles to make the corner units. And then again, we still have that same center section. So you're simply going to place these together. I like to line up the perpendicular side here, sew it, press it open, and then you're going to take this one, you'll line it up so that it's lined up out there, sew it, press it open, and then this square will be able to be sewn to this one. Let me demonstrate that. So here's what I've done so far. I've taken that triangle, I've made it even here, stitched a 1/4-inch seam allowance, pressed it open, and I'm pressing the seam to the triangle itself. Then I'm going to take the opposite one here, and I'm going to place this right here, make sure this is all even right on this side, and then I'm going to sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance there and press it back. Let me sew that, I'll bring it right back and show it to you. So now I've sewn the unit together, and you definitely have to make sure you have a 1/4-inch seam allowance there. I've pressed everything to the outside triangles. Now I'm simply going to press this dark triangle to this one. And you'll definitely want to use a leader as you begin, because you're coming on a point there, and having a little leader under your sewing machine. It's a little piece of fabric, scratch fabric, just have it under there, stitch across it, and then stitch onto this, and sew your 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then you will press it, and I will press everything to the dark. Then this unit must be squared up to 4.5 inches. It needs to be 4.5 inches to fit in the block itself. I've sewn it. I started with a leader here as I sewed across that seam allowance, and I'm going to press it here. I can cut this little leader away and get rid of it. That's just a little scrap fabric. It's called a leader. You can use leaders and enders to help you come onto and off of squares and blocks and so forth as you're quilting or piecing. So here we have it, and you want to make sure you don't lose your point. And now this has to be squared up to 4.5 inches. I'm pressing mine toward the dark. And so that is how you make each of these units. This kind of fell away. I've lost a square here. Here we go. So that is how you put this together. For every duck and ducklings block, you'll want to put it together like that. I would put these units together if I were you, and then once the units are together, then you can sew the 3 rows together. Another very simple block. It looks complicated. It is not. It's really quite simple. And when you're if you're just using this block only in a quilt, there are a lot of secondary designs that you're going to see as you're looking across the quilt. That's always quite fun with some of these scrappy blocks. So these are some of the blocks that you need for this quilt. Let me show you the wall quilt, which is behind me. So this is the wall quilt. And I love the secondary designs that you see in that quilt. That's a neat arrangement. The directions here tell you exactly how to lay out each of the blocks, and it lets you know how many of each of the blocks you need to make. This is the queen size quilt, and you're basically seeing 4 of these wall quilts within that. It makes a beautiful, beautiful queen size quilt. Many of you have been joining me as I work through this book and show you how to make the blocks for each and every one of the patterns. Next week, I'm going to be sharing with you how to make the Marching Monkeys quilt blocks. There are 2 blocks in this one, the Road to Oklahoma and the Snail's Tail. And I have a really fun and fast way to make that snail's tail. So we'll be working on that one next week. And now I'm going to give you some close-ups of the wall quilt that's behind me, the Ducks in My Pond quilt. So let me show you that. So here is the wall quilt, the Ducks in My Pond. And I love the quilt. It's a very pretty quilt. I have it hanging there on the wall. There are 4 different blocks. Now I've shown you each and every block and how to put it together. I hope you'll join me as we continue going through this book, the Scrappy Quilt Patterns, the Speedy Solutions Quilt Patterns, and learn how to make each and every one of the quilts that is in this book. I did do a faux flange binding on that quilt, as you'll see there, and I do have a how-to tutorial not only in a video format on my YouTube channel, which I will link below, but I also have it available in written instructions out on my website under the how-tos, so you can check that out. Thank you so much for joining me today on my channel, Quilting with Lori. If you do like the content that I provide on my channel, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share my videos with your friends, with your quilt guilds. I do really appreciate that. All of that helps to get my channel out to other quilters just like yourself. Thank you so much for doing that. So until next week, have a wonderful week and happy quilting.